Hello everybody and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips. According to the promoters of paleo and other bad diets, people should avoid eating grains because they cause inflammation and they cause disease. Whole grains, I want to start with some definitions, and I think you'll understand why in a minute here. Whole grains includes foods like whole wheat, oats, brown rice, basmati rice, jasmine rice, rye, barley, buckwheat, bulgur, quinoa, corn, farro, kamut, millet, and spelt. And quinoa is technically a seed, but we throw it into the grain category because it's used in much the same way. Whole grains does not include bagels, pastry, cookies, white flour pasta, croissants, pretzels, and cereals like Lucky Charms, okay? This may seem like a statement of the obvious, whole natural foods versus highly processed junk foods, but there seems to be some considerable misunderstanding about this issue. Grain bashers like William Davis, the famous author of Wheat Belly, claim that their patients are sick because they eat grain-based products like, and I'm going to give you the list because it was actually taken out of his book, Wonder Bread, Trix, Fruit Loops, Ho-Ho's, Oreos, Vienna Fingers, and Fettuccine Alfredo. They apparently do not understand the difference between eating highly processed products and wheat berries and millet loaf, all right? But seriously, the people who come in here are sick from eating Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms and Ho-Ho's and Oreos, right? That is not whole grains. If that is being used as a basis for not eating grains, we can discount that advice. Those who advise against eating grains claim, among other things, that eating grains increases inflammation levels. While this might be true if you're consuming the junk that I just listed off for you, the opposite appears to be the case for real whole grain foods, the first list that I read off to you, which have been shown to reduce inflammation, the opposite of what these folks are saying. A very well-designed study involving 81 participants showed clearly both the benefits of consuming whole grains and the difference between diets based on refined versus whole grain products. Very interesting study. For the first 2 weeks, subjects maintained their typical Western style and weight-maintaining diet. Then for the next 6 weeks, 40 subjects stayed on that diet, while the other 41 were switched to a diet that included whole grain foods. Both diets were similar in calories and fat, the number of servings of fruits and vegetables, and the percentage of protein. The meals were prepared by trained staff and designed to make sure that the participants would not lose weight. Now, the reason they went to all this trouble was to isolate the effects of the whole grain consumption, since factors like eating more fruits and vegetables or losing weight have been shown to decrease inflammation levels. Those subjects eating whole grains had favorable changes in their gut microbiomes, including a decrease in pro-inflammatory bacteria. They also showed small but statistically significant and favorable changes in plasma markers for inflammation and an improvement in immune function. Iranian researchers conducted a study involving 44 overweight or obese girls between the ages of 8 and 15. The girls were randomized to two groups, one that consumed whole grains and then a control group. Girls in the whole grain group were given a list of whole grains and asked to make sure that half of their grain intake, these weren't even converted to all whole grains, they needed to have half of their grain intake from whole grains daily for just 6 weeks. They were asked to avoid whole grains for a 4-week washout period and then crossed over to the other group for an additional 6 weeks. These crossover studies are very important because they show you the differences when the same individual engages in different behaviors. Well, not surprisingly, girls in the whole grain group consumed an average of, the girls in the grain group consumed an average of 98 grams of whole grain per day. The control group took in 11 grams per day. Eating whole grains did not affect weight or BMI, which is not surprising because there really weren't significant differences in the diet other than the whole grains, which again is very important, just like the previous study, to isolate the effect. There were positive changes in inflammatory markers during the 6-week intervention period. These included a 22% decrease in C-reactive protein, a 28% reduction in soluble intracellular adhesion molecule 1. The girls in the control group had increases, not decreases, of 12% and 6% respectively during the same period. So the key here is, I hope you're seeing a trend. The studies are showing exactly the opposite of what the paleo and grain bashers are telling you, which is grains decrease inflammation, not increase inflammation if you're eating whole grains. It's the refined foods that are the problem. Now, overweight people have higher levels of inflammation, but the overweight girls in this study that I just told you about still showed lower levels of inflammatory markers, even though their weight did not change. Again, I'm citing these studies because they've been able to isolate the effects specifically of the whole grains. The other thing I want to point out is the girls did not convert to a program of dietary excellence. In fact, they were permitted to consume half of their grain intake in refined and processed form. And so the fact that just changing half of the grain intake had a positive effect. Think what would happen if they'd gone the whole distance and adopted a whole foods, low fat, high fiber, plant-based diet, and all the grains that had been consumed were whole grain. The other thing I'll mention is that this was 6 weeks. Think about the rapidity of the effect here, that just 6 weeks of whole grain eating, half of the grain consumption being whole grain, had a positive effect. A more recent study included 60 Danish adults who were considered high risk for developing metabolic syndrome. And a randomized crossover trial, again, important. Subjects were assigned to 2 8-week dietary intervention periods during which they consumed either a whole grain diet or a refined grain diet. The first 8 weeks were followed by a 6-week washout period, after which the subjects switched diet. Not surprisingly, and again, in keeping with the results I've already reported, the whole grain diet resulted in fewer calories consumed and more weight loss than the refined grain diet. But in addition, the whole grain diet reduced markers of inflammation such as interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein. Other studies have shown that not only does whole grain reduce inflammation, but it improves glucose metabolism, increases weight loss, decreased risk of developing type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, obesity, and decreasing fasting glucose. Now, I want to be clear about the reason why I'm talking about this. It is not to promote the idea that all you have to do is eat whole grains, because there's enough of this kind of reductionism going on. Just add whole grains to your diet and magical, fantastical things will happen to you. You don't have to do anything else and your health is going to be fine. I've advised for many, many years that there are no magical foods and nutrients, and that the only true health comes from a total dietary change, the whole pattern changing, weight loss, exercise, sleep. I mean, the whole person, the whole approach to health. People who eat whole grains as part of an optimal dietary plan benefit most. But even when the only variable is whole grain intake, the results are better. And so my point in all of this is not to make you think that this is a magical food, just eat it, everything will be fine, as much as it is to get you to start questioning these people who say that grains are bad for you. By the way, one other thing I'll mention is that some of the same people tell others that beans are bad for them, legumes are bad for them because of the lectins. I wrote a very extensive article on lectins, very well referenced, and that, along with this article, posted in the Health Brace Library if you want to read more on this topic. All right, as usual, I'll pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it, and I will be back to you next week with more news.